I want to talk now about the 1968 election specifically. And in order to do so, I need to drop back just a bit to 1964 to set the stage. Just to remind everyone that Lyndon Baines Johnson, assumed the presidency on the death of John Kennedy in Dallas, moving from the vice presidency to the presidency. And it was really in 1964 that Lyndon Johnson won the presidency outright, in his own right, you might say. Now, many of Johnson's biographers, in particular Robert Caro, have talked about the sort of psychology of Lyndon Johnson and this desire that he had to prove himself, to measure himself successfully against other political figures of note, including, in particular, Franklin Roosevelt. Well, it's worth noting here then that in 1964, when he ran on his own for the presidency, Lyndon Johnson secured a margin of victory greater than anything Franklin Roosevelt had ever achieved. If I remember correctly, Johnson had achieved somewhere over 60% of the popular vote, which in American presidential politics is just a huge majority in the popular vote, just absolutely huge. You might also recall that Johnson will begin in 1964 pushing a whole slate of legislation revolving around the Great Society. So coming out of the 1964 election, it would almost seem that Johnson might very well out Roosevelt, that he might accomplish more, that he might create an even more impressive record, even as that record would be tied all the way back to the New Deal and the use of the federal government, the national government, to achieve political ends. And yet, only 4 years later, right? 4 years later, Lyndon Johnson is going to be in this sort of race for his political life. And I think we have to start out here by asking ourselves, why? Part of it has to do with 1968 itself. Part of it has to do with other issues, long building issues in the United States. But in 1968, in early 68, you may remember from Melanie Story's lecture on Vietnam, you have the Tet Offensive occur. And basically, remember, the Tet Offensive boils down to North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops or insurgents actually attacking sites within the cities of South Vietnam, and doing so simultaneously across South Vietnam. Now, the problem with that, in particular for Lyndon Johnson, is that Johnson, his administration, and the military commander in Vietnam, General Westmoreland, had for several years been saying that victory was in sight, that the United States was engaged in what would ultimately prove to be a winning effort in Vietnam. And you may recall that more and more American troops had been called into Vietnam to fight this war. There had to be something successful to show for the use of all these troops, for the casualties, and ultimately for the deaths. What Tet demonstrated to many Americans was the hollowness of the claims that were being made by the Johnson administration. Claims that arguably were often based on what Johnson was being told by military commanders, that the war was winnable and in fact was being won. Regardless of the military side of things, and I think it's perfectly fair to argue that from a military perspective, the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese, were driven out of the cities. In many ways, the Viet Cong were crippled after Tet. It was a military victory on the ground, but the political consequences are what ultimately get Johnson. Because, as Walter Cronkite would very famously say on the news, Walter Cronkite being one of the major broadcasters of the era, after Tet, he would essentially call into question this potential for victory in Vietnam. And Johnson would respond by saying, if we've lost Cronkite, we've lost middle America. We've lost the bulk of American voters who have supported my agenda. That's the problem for Johnson. It's political. In fact, his own Democratic Party was already split. It was already fractured between the Democrats who believed that the war and Johnson's policies were the way to go, those needed to be continued, and also groups that would have said, no, the war needs to end now, and associated Lyndon Johnson, of course, with the war itself. So Johnson needs to go. That splintering of the Democratic Party was already clear by 1967, certainly. But what you may expect for 1968 becomes far more concrete when in March of 1968, Lyndon Johnson suffers what amounts to a defeat in the New Hampshire primary. Now remember, a primary is where members of a political party nominate a candidate for presidency. And by and large, an incumbent, someone who's already in office, tends to have an advantage. They have name recognition, they have other potential resources to draw on for a successful campaign. But in 1968, in New Hampshire, it's Senator Eugene McCarthy. I almost said Joseph McCarthy, sorry. But it's Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota who actually runs successfully against Lyndon Johnson in New Hampshire. McCarthy wins 20 of 24 convention delegates, and 42% of the popular primary vote in New Hampshire against Lyndon Johnson, an incumbent, but more importantly, an incumbent who just 4 years earlier had won the presidency by the widest margin in history. How much change there could be in 4 years. After seeing Eugene McCarthy's successful run against Lyndon Johnson, and McCarthy's not a particularly well-known figure. I mean, he's well-known, but don't get me wrong, but in a popular national sense. It's Robert Kennedy, the brother of John Kennedy, former Attorney General of the U.S., and a man who really didn't like Lyndon Johnson any more than Lyndon Johnson liked him. But it's enough. That push in New Hampshire by McCarthy is enough to get Senator Robert Kennedy to decide to enter the Democratic primary as a potential nominee from New York. With this insurgency within the Democratic Party, on March the 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson goes on television. And he announces to the American public that he is scaling back the bombing in Vietnam. And he says, and this is, a little bit afterward, after he's made the notification about the bombing, he says that he will not be a candidate for the presidency. Again, it's just amazing. This apparently hugely popular figure, continuing this New Deal tradition, in fact, enlarging the tradition in many ways with the sort of radicalness of some of his programs. Here's Johnson saying 4 years after this great victory, I'm not even going to be a candidate. He says, if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. It is a thunderbolt in the American political scene. Shortly thereafter, on April the 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. He's in Memphis, and he's in Memphis for a garbage workers' strike to support the garbage collectors in Memphis, many of whom are African American, because the conditions in which they work and the wages they're paid are just so horrendous. It's an interesting encounter for Martin Luther King Jr., who has really built his reputation on peaceful resistance. As he's marching through Memphis, essentially rioting breaks out around him. In fact, he is in considerable danger. And it's an extraordinarily troubling event for him as the forces of violence seem to be moving beyond his control. Memphis is also a situation where King can demonstrate the linkage between civil rights and economic opportunity. He gives that great speech. A great speech in which he says, you remember that he's been to the mountaintop. He says, I may not get there with you. It's almost a prophetic speech in a way, as if he knew, which surely he didn't, but as if he knew that his time was short anyway. Probably didn't know that he was going to be killed shortly thereafter. But he is on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel when he is shot and killed. Major riots break out in more than 60 American cities. And it's an interesting side note that Robert Kennedy, who's on the campaign trail, will speak out and call for calm. He doesn't get it, but he calls for it. It's as if Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother, is sort of this last Democratic option here that could potentially hold together that Roosevelt coalition that could, or at least some of it, parts of it, that could pull African and American minorities and majority together, that could overcome the Johnson policies in Vietnam. And then on June the 6th, Robert Kennedy is making an appearance, having just won the California primary. He is in a ballroom in a Los Angeles hotel. He makes his way from the stage, having delivered a brief speech, back through the kitchen area. It's late at night. And even while the applause from his speech and the murmurings of the crowd are continuing, he is shot by a young Palestinian, Sirhan. And he too is assassinated. Now, just think of that for a moment. March the 31st, the incumbent president says, I'm not going to run. April the 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. June the 6th, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. It seemed in 1968, with assassinations, riots, violence, a government that had been perhaps less than truthful with the American people, it seemed as if the things most dependable in life were no longer dependable. Maybe they never had been, really. Indeed, I would say they hadn't. And yet, you have to, I think, be empathetic in that sense. You have to imagine the blow. None of this would be helped by the Democratic Convention in Chicago in August of 1968. August 26th through August 29th, Democrats met in convention, reached their nominee, who would turn out to be none other than Hubert Humphrey, vice president under Johnson. Inside the convention, there was disorder, the factions struggling for power in terms of making the nomination, a fear among some that the nominee, whoever it would be a Johnson wannabe who would seek to continue the policies of Lyndon Johnson. There was a massive argument over the anti-war plank, but it was outside the convention that some of the worst emerges. Mayor Richard Daley, a bit of a machine politician, and also a sort of no-nonsense figure, not afraid to use the force of the police or whatever was necessary to maintain law and order. Richard Daley has, well, in fact, during previous riots, he had ordered Chicago police to shoot to kill arsonists. Daley wants to maintain order around the convention for Chicago's, the public image of Chicago, but also for the Democratic Party. What actually ends up happening is that thousands of demonstrators gather in a park outside the convention hall, and on August the 28th, with reporters watching, some thousands of Chicago police, the Army, and the National Guard ultimately move in on the protesters. The police have been called in to 12-hour shifts. They're none too thrilled. And all of this is being caught on TV as protesters are tear gassed and beaten and put into paddy wagons. And the great chant that went up on television and went around the world was, "The whole world is watching." It's that old notion that goes back through the civil rights movement, in fact, that part of what we're playing for is a sort of moral embarrassment. That the world is watching in the midst of Cold War. And that passive resistance, though I must say the protesters weren't always so very passive, but resistance that's televised, that's put out for consumption, may reveal truths that are not desirable, a little bit humiliating perhaps. Well, that was the purpose of the protests. And in some ways, Richard Daley acceded to their wishes, the wishes of the protesters. They got their moment on camera. For the Democratic Party, this most dominant party in the mid-20th century within the United States, it was a nightmare. And it would open the door for the beginnings of a shift in American politics, a noticeable shift. The shift had been going on for some time, but a noticeable shift in American politics and an opening for the emergence of the new right and more conservative American politics. We'll pick up the story there in the next segment.